So how do you strike this delicate balance between keeping the public safe and maintaining a sense of normality? We're joined by Dan O'Shea from Tampa, Florida. He's a former U.S. Navy SEAL commander, one of the world's toughest special ops units. This year, Isil, of course, has attacked Western targets in a way that we haven't seen before. With so much security at these New Year's celebrations, how likely would it be for Isil to attack main venue sites, in your estimation?
Well, it's obviously a very aggressive target for them. They would love to hit Times Square, but arguably, as we found out in San Bernardino just a few weeks ago, they can hit any town, any community, anywhere in the world, from Paris to San Bernardino. So it may be New York City is certainly a target, but literally any city in the United States, any city in the world is a potential target for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these folks that are inspired by this ideology.
Do they see these as high-value targets? I mean, when we think about these big events, the Boston Marathon obviously targeted years ago, the football games in Paris, that was a site they didn't pull it off, as well as a concert venue. Is this something that they look at?
Absolutely. Terrorism is fueled by the media exposure. And in fact, I've made this comment, for those of us who've come back from a decade overseas where this is a common occurrence in Baghdad, in Kabul, and throughout the Middle East and many of these countries, throughout Africa, it's now coming back to the West. And it's the reality that it scares a lot of us who had to deal with suicide bombings, car bombings, IEDs on a daily basis. It's now coming back to the West, and it's very troubling because it's going to be very tough to combat this when you're inspired by these lone wolf attacks coming from folks that are being indoctrinated online by this ISIS ideology. And of course, the message is being sent that you can do this in anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the world, and therefore, of course, it's something that's got every police department in the United States concerned, and rightfully so.
Dan, what did you learn overseas you think that could be implemented here? I mean, these are soft targets packed with thousands of people. How do you harden them and not take away from the festivities?
Well, that's always the challenging, that's the difficult issue. I mean, law enforcement, especially big departments like New York City, there's no finer, larger fighting, law enforcement capability in anywhere in the world. I mean, there's over 50,000 law enforcement officials, cops all the way down to patrolmen in the New York City Police Department, and they're some of the best counterterrorism folks on the planet. I've briefed these guys. I have tremendous respect for them, but it's the reality that it's everywhere in the United States. So it's people in small towns, in communities like San Bernardino, where everyone has a responsibility to, if you see something, you have to report it. The tragedy is one of the neighbors of the San Bernardino, husband and wife couple, they didn't want to report them because they didn't want to offend them, or they didn't want to, be, considered, inappropriate. But, in this day and age, if you see something, you have to report it, because the security is not just the responsibility of law enforcement. First responders can't get there in time, although, immediately. It's got to be something that everyone takes on as the onus, as a responsibility for this new reality we live in.
Yeah, the new normal. And Dan, it's interesting you bring that up, because in Karina's piece, they talked about it. If you see something, say something. You just said it as well. But we don't have your eyesight. I mean, you're kind of a trained professional. You probably see something that most of us wouldn't look at, or maybe give a second glance. What are some things that we should be looking at? Or how should we be looking at things differently, do you think?
Well, any trained, in the military, law enforcement, it's a term called situational awareness, and that you evaluate everywhere you go. You're constantly looking for anything out of the ordinary. I mean, if you're in an environment where it's kind of warm, I mean, it's unseasonably warm right now in many countries, or many cities here, even in the United States. So, someone wearing a bulky jacket, someone with a backpack, someone who's looking around. I mean, you have to be aware. It's like at airports, in major, transportation, venues, from subways to airports. If you leave a suitcase around for more than 2 minutes, 5 minutes, people are going to report it right away. But you have to look at this, like events like New Year's Eve celebrations. They're going to want to target something like that, and in particular soft targets. I mean, most of these attacks happen in soft target areas. I mean, Paris is virtually a gun-free zone, the entire city, and look what happened in Paris. San Bernardino, California laws against guns and gun ownership and everything else. So they will always find a way to exploit it. So sometimes, people you have to be cognizant. If you see something that's out of the ordinary, call it in. And that's just the critical point, that Americans are going to get more and more used, and Westerners are going to get, this is going to become the new normal, sadly enough. It's taken a decade to come home. But it's going to, Paris and San Bernardino are not going to be the last attacks by groups like ISIS that are going to happen here in the West.
All right, Dan O'Shea joining us from Tampa, Florida. Thanks so much for your insights.